Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here today. Welcome, and thank you for joining. This is our second annual Equity and Justice Speaker Seminar. And we have the pleasure today of welcoming Joan Roughgarden to help us kick this off. And this is the first in a three-part series that we're hosting this spring. Our next speeches will be in April, one in April and one in May. So here we are hosting this at NCEAS, and NCEAS is the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. And we at NCEAS work to accelerate scientific discoveries that will enhance our understanding of the world and benefit people and nature, as well as to transform the scientific culture to be more open, efficient, and collaborative. So for more information on NCEAS, you can check out our website at nceas.ucsb.edu. And before we begin here with our first talk, we'd like to ask you to join us in acknowledging the Chumash people, who are the environmental stewards of the land on which NCEAS and UCSB are located. So we pay our respects to the Chumash people and their elders, past, present, and future, who call this place their home. We acknowledge that this land on which we live and work are traditional homelands of Indigenous people, including the Chumash peoples. And this land today is the result of erasures and exclusions of Indigenous people. As we come together to bring awareness to issues of equity and justice, we recognize that the Chumash people and so many other Indigenous peoples are still fighting to dismantle the legacies of settler colonialism in their tribal territories. As we continue to work towards diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in data science and ecology, we strive to prioritize indigenous data sovereignty and self-determination. So for all of you joining us here for this webinar, we'll be using the Q&A section of Zoom located at the bottom of your screen to ask all of our questions of Joan. So please feel free to add questions whenever they come to you throughout the seminar and through that feature in the Q&A section. And then at the end, we will have a moderated Q&A between Heather and Joan, and we'll include these questions at the end of the presentation there. And now I will hand it off to Heather to introduce Joan and get this started. Thanks so much for being here.
Great, thanks, Courtney. Hi, everybody. I'm Heather Lahr. I'm a project manager here at NCEAS. And I'm really excited to welcome Joan Roughgarden, our first speaker of the series. She has received 2 bachelor's degrees in biology and philosophy from the University of Rochester and got her doctorate in biology from Harvard University. She taught at Stanford for nearly 40 years, retiring in 2011. But not quite retiring. She joined University of Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology in 2012, and she joins us today from Kauai. Joan has published more than 190 papers and 9 books, including Evolution's Rainbow, Diversity, Gender, and Sexuality in Nature and People, and the novel Ram 250, a Ramayana epic for the future. A group of us here at NCEAS did do a wonderful book club talking about Joan's book, and so we're excited to talk with her after this. She joins us today to discuss natural variation in gender expression and sexuality with implications for evolutionary theory. We did want to let the audience know there are some fun, sexually explicit animal photos in the presentation that Joan uses to demonstrate her research perspective. But we are really excited to have you here, Joan. And unfortunately, with the webinar, you can't hear a resounding applause in the background as if you were here in person with us. So you can just, I will clap for you and go ahead. You can take it away from here. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Heather. And I thank you and members of the seminar's organizing committee for the opportunity to speak with you. I'm honored to be with you via Zoom. I fondly remember spending a sabbatical at NCEAS over 20 years ago. The first part of this talk reviews some natural variation in gender expression and sexuality that is either not sufficiently known or is problematic for evolutionary theory. The second part calls attention to a definition of sexual selection that was developed during a workshop I organized at NESCENT in 2013, and contrasts this definition with one recently proposed by David Shuker and Kvarnemo. Sorry. This slide illustrates geckos from Pacific islands that reproduce asexually. Many species of vertebrates, including lizards and fish, reproduce asexually. Asexual reproduction may be obligate or facultative in vertebrates. Facultative asexual reproduction occurs in snakes, varanid lizards, birds, and sharks. Asexual reproduction provides an upper bound to the costs of sex that a species should tolerate. For example, if the so-called battle of the sexes becomes sufficiently deleterious, then an evolutionary option, and in some species a behavioral option, is not to bother with sexual reproduction and to reproduce asexually instead. To the contrary, the decision to reproduce sexually is a decision to cooperate, to mix genes rather than to clone. The overarching benefit to sexual reproduction is that the arithmetic average fitness through time for a sexually reproducing species is higher than the geometric mean fitness through time for an asexually reproducing species. This insight underlies W.D. Hamilton's 1980 special case, in which the fluctuations in fitness through time were attributed to host-parasite oscillations. Sexual reproduction has evolved over asexual reproduction to realize a higher long-term fitness in a fluctuating environment. There is no reason to accept the hypothesis that sex evolved to eliminate bad genes from the gene pool. Thus, sex starts with cooperation. This slide shows a human egg with human sperm, illustrating the size difference between these two types of gametes. The biological definition of male and female applies to all living things, from seaweeds to sea lions. Namely, a male is an individual that makes solely sperm throughout its life, a female is an individual that makes solely eggs throughout its life, and a hermaphrodite is an individual that makes both eggs and sperm during its life, either at the same time or at different times. By definition, the sperm is the smaller gamete and the egg is the larger gamete. Therefore, the origin of the distinction between male and female rests with the origin of a size difference between gametes, called anisogamy. Anisogamy evolves as a strategy to increase fertilization rates. That is, more gametic contacts occur in seawater when a cloud of large gametes is intersected by a cloud of small gametes than by two clouds of medium-sized gametes intersecting each other. There is no reason to accept the hypothesis of Parker, Baker, and Smith in 1979 that, quote, males are dependent on females and propagate at their expense, as in a parasite-host relationship, unquote, and that, quote, primordial sexual conflict concerned the origin of anisogamy itself, unquote. The origin of male and female does not represent a battle of the gametes. Given the origin of anisogamy, the next conceptual issue is how these gametes are packaged into bodies, both egg and sperm together in one body, called hermaphrodism, or eggs in one body and sperm in another body, called diece. A simultaneous hermaphrodite produces both sperm and eggs at the same time. A sequential hermaphrodite produces eggs and sperm at different times. Sequential hermaphrodites come in two varieties: male first, then female, versus female first, then male. Sequential hermaphrodites change sex during life. That means, by definition, they transition from making sperm to making eggs, or vice versa. Furthermore, some fish multiply switch, for example, changing from juvenile to male to female and then back to male. Most plants are hermaphroditic. Only about 6% of plant species have separate sexes. most animals have separate sexes. Only about 6% of all animal species are hermaphroditic. On the left are blue-headed wrasses, a species with some individuals who change from female to male. In the middle are clownfish, a species with some individuals who change from male to female. And on the right are hamlets, a species with individuals who are simultaneously male and female. Hamlets do not self-fertilize. The figure depicts the mating dance, wherein one fish releases eggs and the other releases sperm. They then turn over and reverse roles. Hermaphrodism is the primitive condition and dioecy is derived, although in some lineages and some ecological conditions, dioecy reverts back to hermaphrodism. Generally speaking, the advantage to evolving from having both eggs and sperm in the same body to having specialized carriers of sperm and eggs is efficiency in locating partners. In fish, parental care of eggs is usually provided by males. On the bottom is a pipefish from a group whose tubular bodies resemble a flute. In pipefish, the males glue the fertilized eggs to their bellies while they swim about. Seahorses are derived from pipefish. In seahorses, the males have a skin flap on their bellies into which females deposit their eggs, causing the male to become, so to speak, pregnant. As a result, females in some seahorse species can produce eggs faster than males can give birth to the eggs they are incubating. Hence, the females can mate with more males than males can mate with females, so that the males become choosy and females promiscuous, called sex role reversal. Sex role reversal is theoretically important because it demonstrates there is no connection between gamete size and sex role. A common sexual selection narrative is that with rare exceptions, males are passionate and females coy, to use Darwin's unfortunate terms, because males with their cheap sperm can afford to play around, whereas females with their expensive eggs stand to lose their reproductive investment if they mate with a genetically inferior male. Now, sex role reverse species demonstrate that either sex can be promiscuous or choosy regardless of gamete size, thereby invalidating claims of a connection between gamete size and sex role. Can animals have gender? Or is gender reserved for humans? I take gender to mean the morphology, behavior, and life history of a sexed body. A, quote, sexed body, unquote, is a body classified with respect to the size of the gametes produced. Now, for species in which most males have certain traits and most females have other traits, a few females may also be found to have female traits and a few females to have male traits. This situation allows for what has been termed transgender animals. The best studied example occurs in sun angel hummingbird species from the Andes. Male sun angel hummingbirds have colorful feathers on their throats called a gorget, as illustrated in the slide. A female with a gorget is referred to as a masculine female. It also has a comparatively shorter bill. Conversely, feminine males also exist with a longer bill. Males use their gorgets in territorial defense of the common short flowers that fit short bills. Masculine females can, like the males, also defend territories of short flowers. Conversely, the feminine males have longer bills than masculine males. Feminine males use different flowers from the masculine males, namely relatively rare, long tubular flowers that do not need to be defended in a territory. What is theoretically important is that gender expression indicates occupation, and transgender birds are those whose occupation crosses into the occupation typical of the other gender. This slide, which I took in 2018 during a safari to South Africa, illustrates two male elephants mating. Charismatic megavertebrates often feature same-sex mating, as do over 100 bird species, and you can see the penis on both of these animals indicating that they're both males. This slide shows male-male mating in rams and lions. The sequence in the top right was given to me by a Brazilian photojournalist. They show one male lion soliciting a mating from another male and then proceeding to a male-male mating. You can see right here, this lion approaches this one, displays to it, nuzzles it, and then the lion on the right then approaches and mounts the male who had solicited it. They get up and then move apart. And this slide, the bottom two photos show that same-sex mating occurs in lions in the presence of a female. This is a female here without a lion's mane, and these are two males. Bonobos are our closest living primate relatives, as shown in the primate family tree at the lower left. In August 2021, just last year, I visited the Appenheuvel Zoo in Holland to photograph bonobos. The top slide shows the Bonobo Habitat at the zoo. The bonobos spend the night in the structure at the top left. Each morning, the zookeeper in the center bottom distributes food. Then the bonobos exit their structure to forage for food, as shown in the lower right. The top left shows the clitoris of a subadult bonobo. The placement of the clitoris facilitates a form of same-sex mating called GG rubbing, where the females rub their clitorises with each other, leading to orgasm accompanied with squeals of pleasure. To alleviate conflict over the food scattered across the habitat, the females carry out lots of same-sex mating in various positions. The top right is face-to-face lying down. The bottom left is face-to-face sitting up. The bottom right is back-to-back. And the top left and center illustrate still more female-female mating positions, back to front and genital touching. Female bonobos could write their own Kama Sutra. Lest one think bonobo behavior is irrelevant to the human experience, the photo at the top right is the primate family tree extending to humans. Bonobos, along with the common chimp, are our closest living primate relatives. The bottom left is the famous 1974 specimen of Australopithecus afarensis, known as Lucy, that was discovered in Ethiopia by Donald Johansen. Notice that the head size and height agree with the bonobo, but Lucy is more bipedal. The lower right shows a hominum family tree illustrating how the genus Australopithecus gave rise to the modern genus Homo. There is speculation in the literature that the placement of the human clitoris might reflect its evolutionarily prior use in female-female mating, a morphological configuration that I term the mark of Sappho. The widespread occurrence of same-sex mating in animals is no longer news to biologists. What to make of it is not so clear. In my view, same-sex mating belongs with many forms of affiliative behavior, including mutual grooming in mammals, preening in birds, and excess heterosexual mating, as shown in the slide. These behaviors lead to the mutual exchange of physical pleasure. Making a big deal about same-sex mating reflects Western culture's fetishizing of sex. The theoretical interest lies with the entire class of mutual affiliative behaviors, not solely same-sex mating. I have proposed that affiliative behaviors underwrite cooperation. Carrying out cooperation requires coordination of activity, and the act of cooperation itself might be pleasurable. How to interpret affiliative behavior and mating behavior in general brings us to the topic of sexual selection. In 2006, in a science article with Errol Ache and Miko Oishi, as well as in later publications, I have argued that sexual selection theory should be abandoned as an explanatory framework in evolutionary biology. My view is illustrated in this slide, wherein what was originally a possibly useful hypothesis to explain the evolution of male ornaments, such as the peacock's tail, has morphed over the years into a bloated and unfalsifiable doctrine of natural conflict, deceit, and sex stereotypes. Today's sexual selection doctrine is as useless to scientific progress as a 3-pound, $5,000 Swiss Army knife is to carpentry. My wholesale rejection of sexual selection provoked a gang of over 40 sexual selection advocates to object in a science rebuttal, to which we then responded. So to develop a constructive way forward, in 2013, I organized a workshop with 34 participants at NESCENT in Durham, North Carolina, to assess the state of sexual selection studies and to suggest future directions. A miniature of the workshop's report is on the bottom left of the slide. A remarkable finding was that participants could not agree on the definition of sexual selection. Therefore, a subcommittee of participants worked to define a definition as discussed later. Then last year, David Shuker and Kvarnemo reviewed the definition of sexual selection for the journal Behavioral Ecology. Their article confirms the NESCENT finding that no generally accepted definition of sexual selection exists. The miniature on the bottom right of the slide presents a full page from the article that was typeset in fine print and shows the many definitions of sexual selection presently in use. Shuker and Kvarnemo also presented their own definition, which I will now contrast with the NESCENT definition. Shuker and Kvarnemo write, quote, "Our main aim in writing this paper is to allow the next generation of sexual selection researchers to address the many questions still left unanswered without the baggage of the definition of sexual selection left lying around," unquote. I agree with this aspiration and thank David Shuker and Carlotta Kvarnemo for their constructive contribution. The NESCENT definition and the Shuker and Kvarnemo definition, hereafter abbreviated as the SK definition, agree on two main points. First, the long-standing association of sexual selection with sex roles and ornaments, including a relation of gamete size to sex role, is discredited and jettisoned once and for all. Both definitions are sex neutral. This is huge. Second, the definitions agree that a distinction is needed between sexual selection and natural selection, or more specifically, between sexual selection and the fertility component of natural selection. The NESCENT and SK definitions do not formulate this distinction in exactly the same terms, but the intent seems similar. The NESCENT report explains the distinction in this way. Consider a female with a fixed clutch. If the bird chooses one male over another because of its color, then sexual selection occurs. Alternatively, suppose the bird has a variable clutch, which depends on resources provided by the male. Then if the bird chooses one male over another because of the quantity of resources it supplies, then both fertility selection and sexual selection occur together. Both male and female prosper from the increased clutch, and additionally, the male prospers because of being selected over males supplying fewer resources. Both NESCENT and SK call for new statistical methods to partition data on courtship behavior into its natural and sexual selection components. Furthermore, with both definitions, sexual selection is restored to its status as a specific hypothesis for how selection shapes mating behavior rather than as a far-reaching doctrine about sexual reproduction generally. The NESCent and SK definitions do have points of disagreement, however. First, the NESCent definition sees mating as serving both social and reproductive roles, whereas the SK definition sees mating as the vehicle for access to gametes. Second, the NESCent definition sees selection as increasing fertilizations via negotiated and coordinated cooperation. This is illustrated in photos of biparental care in albatrosses and penguins that I took in the Falklands, South Georgia, and Antarctica in 2019. In contrast, the SK definition sees selection as winning at competition for mates. Both definitions define evolutionary success as an increase of genes in the gene pool, but differ on the behavioral mechanisms to attain that increase. I think it's a mistake for SK to stipulate the word competition in their definition. The definition should be neutral about competition and cooperation. Because the NESCent definition is neutral about the behavioral mechanism underlying sexual selection, and the SK definition is not, the NESCent definition should be preferred to the SK definition. To stipulate competition as the mechanism of sexual selection, as SK have done, invites two theoretical traps. First is the need to view cooperation as really competition in disguise. For example, by claiming two males are really just competing when offering different degrees of cooperation to a female. This phrasing privileges competition over cooperation. Second is the need to specify an object of competition, which SK do, with a distinction between gametes and resources as the objects of competition. More generally, courtship behavior is not about competition for objects, but is a system for offering bids in the exchange of fitness, as the next slide discusses. The NESCent report illustrates how to test whether behavior is cooperative or competitive in the context of models for specific situations. For example, consider a male who allocates time into helping a female produce eggs versus guarding, and consider a female who allocates time into foraging versus being available for mating. The reproductive pie is the clutch of eggs. Fecundity selection on the male favors increasing the size of the pie by helping the female. Sexual selection on the male favors increasing the fraction of that pie that he sires. The slide illustrates male and female fitnesses for all possible time allocations. The right edge of the envelope shows the boundary along which no win-win solutions are possible, but instead increasing the fitness of the male reduces that of the female and vice versa. The best compromise of time allocations for both parties is a green dot that is computed mathematically as the Nash bargaining solution. The non-cooperative time allocations are at a red dot that is computed mathematically as the Nash equilibrium, which is clearly worse fitness for both parties. The threat of realizing the red dot motivates the male and the female to find time allocations that attain the green dot. So during courtship, the male and the female communicate their preferred time allocations and either adjust their own allocations accordingly or find other partners that do. If a model like this for a specific situation is made quantitative, then the predicted time allocations can be compared with the observed allocations, thereby testing for the existence of a cooperative versus competitive breeding arrangement. Furthermore, The exchange of physical pleasure provides a way to communicate the desired time allocations during courtship and to maintain or adjust those allocations afterwards. Thus, if the male and the female are playing competitively with each other, their allocations should match the red dot, and no affiliative interaction should occur. Conversely, if they are playing cooperatively, their allocation should match the green dot, and the cooperating pair should participate in continual affiliative interactions that impart a mutual exchange of pleasure to maintain the coordination needed for successful cooperation. Now, most bird species are socially monogamous, perhaps as high as 95%, many of which provide biparental care to their chicks. Hence, courtship in most birds is predicted to be primarily cooperation rather than competition. Many of my thoughts in this seminar are traced to my book Evolution's Rainbow, published 18 years ago in 2004. The book has sold well and has been translated into Korean, Portuguese, and Spanish. My sequel, The Genial Gene, was published 5 years later in 2009 and is also available in French. I've published numerous articles on gender and sexuality up until 2017. But at that time I felt I had done all I could on the topic and decided to move on. For the last 5 years, my research has been on mathematical models for the evolution of holobionts. Because this seminar belongs to a series at NCEAS devoted to fostering diversity and inclusion in our scientific community, I feel I should add a few words for students and others early in their careers. Sexual selection has been contentious since the time of Darwin. What I have faced seems different from previous disputes. I've encountered anger, mistrust, bullying, ganging up, dead naming, and both homophobic and transphobic comments in professional articles and book reviews. I have documented many of these in an article I published in Daedalus in 2007. Even today, my Wikipedia page is the locus of continued trolling by sexual selection advocates. Whenever someone posts something positive about Evolution's Rainbow or about me personally, a troll removes it. And it's hard to overlook the comments in Shuker and Kvarnemo and elsewhere, denigrating my contributions and misrepresenting what I have written. Sexual selection advocates even managed to suppress the publication of the NESCent workshop report so that it languishes on a preprint server. As someone early in your career, you may face the situation I faced. If you are comfortable with the extended sexual selection doctrine, then fine. But if you have doubts, what do you do? What if you really think the commonly accepted propositions are wrong and harmful? Propositions espoused by your thesis advisor or your tenure and promotion committees. Do you go along to get along? Well, lots of luck with that. It will kill you. You'll find that you either have to leave the field or press on in the face of hostility and lack of support. For my part, I felt I had a responsibility to stay. One has no choice, really, so you play the hand you're dealt. Concerning sexual selection specifically, if you harbor doubts, I invite you to read the first 2 chapters in The Genial Gene that criticize various sexual selection narratives. Then, if still interested, continue on to the other chapters and papers that offer my alternative hypotheses to the standard stories. All in all, the future of sexual selection studies looks promising now that the basic issue of sexual selection's definition is finally being seriously considered. This will lead to more testable hypotheses and more convincing science. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you so much, Joan. I am trying to share my video and remove, I've pinned you in the process. So again, I'm sorry you can't hear the resounding applause in the background, but I will clap for you. So everybody, we do have the Q&A is open. If you are chatting things, only the hosts and panelists can see them. So just to let you know, in the Q&A, you can also upvote questions if you have any, and we'll go ahead and take questions. But one thing, Joan, that when I was reading through the book, one thing that I enjoyed about it was this idea of female choice and the idea that females are not always choosing the flashiest outfit. Sometimes they're choosing the best dads. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about potentially the animals that you saw that in, just maybe a little bit more about this idea of female choice, and that it's a little bit broader than what the sexual selection theory originally said.
Well, just as you say, in Evolution's Rainbow 18 years ago, I recall citing an example, I think, with crabs. And there was an interesting experimental setup in which females actually had the chance of choosing a male who was a better competitor vis-a-vis other males versus choosing a male who would provide more resources or protection, I forget the details, for the eggs she was rearing. And she, of course, chose the better dad. And I think there, I wouldn't be surprised if there were a lot more examples of that.
Perfect, thanks. Here's another question. Do you think that the use of sex role reversal as terminology also reinforces the idea that sex roles exist and are in some way biologically determined?
Yes, I agree with that, and I think it's an unfortunate use of terms, but that's the accepted term, and I don't know what to replace it with, because it does even implicitly acknowledge that there's a distinction between choosy and promiscuous, and that might not even be the case. But at any rate, it's sufficient, hopefully, to plunge a dagger into the cheap sperm, expensive egg connection to sex roles.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have another question that came up in the chat is, what is the role of intention in understanding animal behavior in general, or sexual behavior in particular? And how can theories that rely on assumptions of animal intention be tested or refuted?
Animal intention. Well, I don't think that the animals, I don't think we're in a position to attribute intention to the animals. We don't, to my knowledge, have methodology to assess that. But not that we couldn't in the future, but mostly intention is a crutch for us as investigators into anticipating what the function is. So, for example, if the intention, so if we might think that the intention of two animals is to cooperate, this would be realized through the exchange of physical pleasure, and the animals don't need to intend to have pleasure, they just go and do it. So I mean, it'd be like looking at just a few minutes ago, I fed our pet cat her food, and so does the cat intend to eat, or does the cat just eat? It just eats. And similarly, I think the cooperation, I think that the cooperation and other behaviors we don't need the notion of, we don't need to attribute that there is intention in the animals. There's just a physical manifestation which motivates them to do what they do. And I think it is fair to say that a cat, if a cat feels hungry, it eats, and if an animal wants, so to speak, pleasure, it goes and seeks pleasure, and that's not a sophisticated intention. That's just plain a desire, um, and and I think that we can reduce um, what we would consider the animal's intention to more primitive desires that have been realized through evolution to accomplish the intention. Hope that's clear.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. Thanks. I was just thinking about my dog as you're thinking about intention, and does he intend to just, lounge around all day? Or is he just lounging around all day? And I think he's just lounging. So it's, yeah. Are there any recent sexual selection studies that you are particularly excited by, or new directions that researchers are going in this field that we should pay particular attention to?
Oh my gosh. As I said, I haven't been following this field for a good 5 years. The I do find that the paper by Shuker and Kvarnemo, and I apologize for stumbling on her name to begin with, is it is an important step, and I think hopefully, and together with this seminar here, will lead to some discussions that are not defensive. And of course, one might say I've provoked some of the defensiveness by the way I've simply indicated that the sexual selection as a doctrine should be discarded, and but I don't see it's we should. The question comes up of, well, could you somehow compromise? Is there some of sexual selection you want to keep? And not of the doctrine really, but I think the type of definition that we developed in the NESCENT proposal does keep a lot of sexual selection, namely the part where sexual selection is increasing fraction of the pie versus or in conjunction with natural selection, which increases the size of the pie. And I think that if we then reinterpret a lot of the cases that are in the literature in light of this distinction, things will get a lot clearer. But if you read, for example, the first 2 chapters in the Genial Gene, you'll just see how much of the doctrine itself of sexual selection is self-contradictory, so how much of it is not supported by data, and how much of it is a spin. And we need to get away from all that stuff and get away from doctrinal storytelling. And that involves doing experimental studies which include as a hypothesis that sexual selection is actually wrong. And as a rule, studies in the sexual selection area take as a given that sexual selection is correct in the main, and then somehow figure out how to torque it or apply it to the case at hand. And that then leads, of course, to confirmation bias. And it's whether sexual selection itself, the whole idea that it's about competition, competition for mates, and that the competition and that female choice by females is for good genes, and that there's a hierarchy of genetic quality, all that sort of stuff. If that's all taken as problematic and itself subject to test rather than as a premise for subsequent storytelling, and I think that to move forward in the field, you have to do exactly what Shuker and Kvarnemo have done, which is just shine a spotlight on it that's critical, and that says, well, now look, a lot of good studies are out there, there's a lot of data, but we have to get straight on what we really mean by sexual selection. And when we do that, then then future researchers will be put on a good starting point.
Excellent, thank you. I think it's amazing, that this book came out nearly 20 years ago and it's still relevant and you're still discussing it, and these ideas are fresh in our community. And we really thank you for joining us and talking about all of these ideas. I guess my one final question here is sort of a flippant one, but as I was mentioning when we were reading it, I felt like I had an arsenal of fun animal facts that I could throw out at cocktail parties. One of my favorite being the spotted hyena and the fact that females actually have penises. So I'm just wondering, as you were researching this, what was one of your favorite animal facts, or as you've been at cocktail parties telling people about these fun animal facts, what is the one that you like to share the most that we could potentially end on?
Oh, well, that's a good one. And but also I think the wanton sexuality of the bonobos is really neat. And I was really privileged to be able to get to this zoo in Holland last year and to take pictures of this, because I'd read about it, but when you really see it, it's really true. And and they're having a good old time in the morning when the food is being gobbled up. But after the food is gone, then everything settles down. They all sit around and don't do much. And another neat thing about the bonobos, of course, is that since these are females, at least some of them at that time were carrying young. And photography is my really passionate hobby. And so and it's just really great to take pictures of the tiny baby bonobo clutching onto the fur of the mother bonobo, and they make great, and the expressions on their faces are just wonderful. And in fact, some of these females were doing the GG rubbing with their babies attached to them. So the babies were being instructed, so to speak, in social discourse as they were doing this. So I guess at this time, my favorite example is the bonobos, because you can relate a little bit more about them than the spotted hyena. I've photographed spotted hyenas in the field in Africa, and I didn't see any of what's been described there. I've seen movies of the photo of the interactions between the bonobos in a compound north of Berkeley. I'm not sure it still exists anymore, but they're raising spotted hyenas, I think, for endocrinology research. But as a side project, they looked at the way they mate and what their social interactions are. In Africa, I didn't see much of that. That the hyenas would be hanging around, waiting for food that a big cat might leave, or so on. So they were sort of scavengers. And I didn't see the behavior that's been described in the literature. In contrast, the bonobos, if you get there early in the morning when the food is being put out there, you can see all this. It's just great.
I can see a book titled The Bonobo Kama Sutra coming our way very soon. I loved that. This last question that just came in is actually similar thread, but just basically that there's a million great examples, but what is your favorite story to teach undergraduates that might help to broaden their general perspective on sexual diversity in the world?
Well, when talking to did you say high school students or
undergraduates?
Undergraduates. Well, it depends if they were scientists or if they were humanities majors, because as I mentioned actually before we got started, I have a version of this talk for a general audience and doesn't go into as much detail about evolutionary thinking and evolutionary theory. And in that general talk, I have a lot of pictures of people in different cultures. And I think one of the best ways to explain the diversity of gender and sexuality among people is to show gender and sexuality expressions in different cultures, in India and Polynesia, and then in history with the Siberian priestesses, and then you start to get a sense of how narrow our concept is and how located it is in Western culture, and how if in fact you gave an introduction to mentioning the Native American tribes, and there are not all of them, but a number of the Native American nations had multiple genders, and so a lot of the diversity, a lot of the way I explain diversity is to show how humans are culturally across different cultures around the world. Because you can go into different animals, and that's, unless someone's a biologist or actually interested in science, that's not very convincing. What people catch on to right away is what other people look like, and how life could be led in other kinds of societies completely. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Oh, I think that's great. And I really want to thank you for joining us today. This talk will be up on our YouTube channel within the next couple of days for everybody that didn't get a chance to see it, or if they want to watch it again. But it is with a heartfelt thanks, Joan, for joining us, and we will keep an eye out for your additional work. And you're always welcome at NCEAS if you make it back to Santa Barbara.
Okay, thank you so much.
Great. Thanks everybody for joining.